conditions of human life are such that suffering is an integral part of existence. Life is suffering. Why? Well, one reason is because of society's arbitrary judgment. Every single one of us has traits and features and quirks and idiosyncrasies that are far from ideal and that are judged by the standards of society as insufficient. And so you suffer because of your imperfect insufficiency in the eyes of others. And you can certainly make the claim that fairly frequently that's arbitrary. And so that's the claim that society is tyrannical and judgmental and needs to be constantly reconstituted so that the tyrannical element doesn't take full control. And fair enough, you have to stay awake so that that doesn't happen. But the thing is, it doesn't matter what society it is, although they vary in the degree of their tyranny. The mere fact that you're grouped together with other people and have to come up with a common value structure in order to live together means that many of the things that characterize you are going to be suboptimal. And so the price you pay for social being is that much of you is deemed insufficient. Now, hopefully there are various ways that you can be within a society that's sufficiently diverse so that you can find a place where what's good about you in the eyes of others and perhaps in your own eyes can flourish of its own accord. Because you don't have to be good at everything. If you can be good at one thing well enough, that might allow you your niche. And hopefully a healthy society allows for that. Certainly societies can become so tyrannical that they don't. The other element of it, clearly, is the mere fact of the arbitrariness of the natural world. You have a lifespan that's going to be counted in the number of decades that you can count on two hands. And that has nothing to do, technically, with the tyranny of the social structure. Now, you could say, if we got our act together more completely, perhaps you could live longer, and fair enough. But the fact of the limits of your lifespan and the suffering that's necessarily a consequence of that, the death of your parents and the death of most people that you will know before you, means that that part of suffering is an integral part of existence itself. And so that can't be laid at the feet of an insufficient social structure except insofar as it's tyrannical and blind. It's a condition of existence. And then by the same token, you have your own responsibility for some of your unnecessary suffering, because there's things you could be doing to make your life better and to make life better for other people that you know perfectly well that you're not doing. So there's three reasons why you suffer, and one is, well, look at you and the way you're built. It's inevitable. There's not very much of you and there's a lot of everything else. And so you just don't last that long and you're fragile across multiple domains, and then you're harshly treated by society, and there's no doubt about that. And then there's responsibility that can be laid at your own feet. The proper pathway through that is to adopt the mode of authentic being. And that is something like refusing to participate in the lie, in deception in the lie, to orient your speech as much as you can towards the truth, and to take responsibility for your own life and perhaps also for the lives of other people. And there's something about that that's meaningful and responsible and noble, but also serves to mitigate the very suffering that produces, say, the nihilism or the flee into the arms of totalitarians to begin with. You need something to shelter you against your own vulnerability. And you can adopt a comprehensive description of reality that's formulated for you by someone else that neatly divides the world into those who are innocent and perhaps innocent victims, and those who are guilty and perhaps the perpetrators of the suffering. But none of that has anything to do with you. And in addition, it's not a reasonable way of assessing the world. The suffering is built in. The existentialist take is, no, that's just how it is. That's just how it is. You don't have to necessarily have done anything wrong for things to get completely out of control. It's a terrifying doctrine, but it's not a hopeless doctrine, because it still says that there's a way forward. There's a pathway forward. And the pathway forward is to adopt a mode of being that has some nobility, so that you can tolerate yourself and perhaps even have some respect for yourself as someone who's capable of standing up in the face of that terrible vulnerability and suffering, and that the pathway forward, as far as the existentialists are concerned, is by, well, certainly by the avoidance of deceit, particularly in language, but also by the adoption of responsibility for the conditions of existence and some attempt on your part to actually rectify them. And the thing that's so interesting about that is, well, two, as far as I'm concerned, and some of this is from clinical experience, if you take people and you expose them voluntarily to things that they are avoiding and are afraid of, that they know they need to overcome in order to meet their goals, their self-defined goals. If you can teach people to stand up in the face of the things they're afraid of, they get stronger. And you don't know what the upper limits to that are, because you might ask yourself, like, if for 10 years, if you didn't avoid doing what you knew you needed to do, by your own definitions, right, within the value structure that you've created to the degree that you've done that, what would you be like? Well, there are remarkable people who come into the world from time to time, and there are people who do find out over decades-long periods what they could be like if they were who they were, if they spoke their being forward. And they get stronger and stronger and stronger, and we don't know the limits to that. We do not know the limits to that. And so you could say, well, in part, perhaps the reason that you're suffering unbearably can be left at your feet, because you're not everything you could be, and you know it. And of course, that's a terrible thing to admit, and it's a terrible thing to consider, but there's real promise in it, right? Because it means that perhaps there's another way that you could look at the world, another way that you could act in the world. So what it would reflect back to you would be much better than what it reflects back to you now. And then the second part of that is, well, imagine that many people did that, because we've done a lot as human beings. We've done a lot of remarkable things. I often ask undergraduates how many hours a day you waste, or how many hours a week you waste. And the classic answer is something like 4 to 6 hours a day. Inefficient studying, watching things on YouTube that not only do you not want to watch, that you don't even care about, that make you feel horrible about watching after you're done. That's probably 4 hours right there. You think, well, that's 25 hours a week. It's 100 hours a month. That's 2.5 full work weeks. It's half a year of work weeks per year. And if your time is worth $20 an hour, which is a radical underestimate, it's probably more like 50 if you think about it in terms of deferred wages. If you're wasting 20 hours a week, you're wasting $50,000 a year. And you are doing that right now. And it's because you're young, wasting $50,000 a year is a way bigger catastrophe than it would be for me to waste it, because I'm not going to last nearly as long. And so if your life isn't everything it could be, you could ask yourself, well, what would happen if you just stopped wasting the opportunities that are in front of you? If you trust people, that's an act of courage. If you're not naive, right? If you're naive, it's an act of stupidity, because you might get bit, and you probably will. And if you're naive and you get bit, you will suffer for it. It'll traumatize you. But if you're not naive and you know you can get bit, then you might ask, well, what should you do with people? And the answer is you should trust them. Not because you're naive, and not because they couldn't betray you, and not because you don't know that they could betray you, but because if you hold out your hand in trust, then you're inviting the best part of that person to step forward, and that won't happen unless you take that initial step, and that's courage, not naivety. And so to trust someone once your eyes are open, that's an act of courage, and that opens up the world. You can withstand it, a fair bit of the catastrophe of life, by establishing the proper covenant and by acting in a trustworthy manner and extending your hand to people properly. So then you might say, well, what would be the upside if we really determined to act honestly? What do you think it is that people would be able to do with the world if we stopped acting in a corrupt manner? I mean, what is the upside? Do you think how far back could we push aging, do you think, if we hit it hard for 50 years? Could we triple our lifespan? It wouldn't surprise me. All these terrible diseases that beset the planet, we could get rid of them. There's no reason for hunger and starvation. We make enough food. It's like, what would happen if we stopped acting badly? How much better could things get? Well, you start locally, I think. You start with yourself and you start with your family. But what's the assumption here exactly? What is the upper end for humanity? I mean, who's going to say, right? Who's going to say, especially in this day and age, man? There's so many things happening that you can't even comprehend them. What could we do if we put all of our effort into it? Well, you can experiment with that, because you can start in your own household. You can start in your own room. And You could make miracles happen in the confines of your own space. There's no doubt about that. All you have to do is try. You'll see that that happens. And people are writing to me and telling me that they're trying this and that that's exactly what's happening. Who knows how tough you are? And maybe you find out by going out to find out how tough you are, right? So you take on a challenge, one that you think you can master. It's just a bit beyond your grasp. And you master it. And then you're a little tougher and you think, hey, that worked out pretty well. And so then you're more of a monster. And then you go out and you find another challenge that's even bigger. And you think, well, maybe I can do that too. And then all of a sudden you can, and you get a little bit bigger. And God only knows what the limit is of you. Who do you want to be when there's a crisis? Right? Do you want to be the person that everyone can turn to for strength? It's like, why the hell not? Why not that as a goal? That'd be a good goal, because then if there's a crisis, and there will be, it won't be such a bloody crisis, because there'll be someone there that can deal with it. You have to contend with death and suffering, and you have to be ready for it, and you have to be there for the person, because that's all they're going to have. And so there's a goal, man. And in this time of nihilism, it's what's the point of life? People ask, and they're taught that at universities. What's the point of life? Everything's interpretation. Humanity's a cancer on the planet. Well, how about no? How about not that? How about that there's something to us? It does require a leap of faith for you to move into the world, because the world is a catastrophe. Self-evidently, the world is a catastrophe. And so there's every reason for you to assume that you should just sit in your basement and hide from it. But that's not, it doesn't help. It doesn't make things better. And the thing is, perhaps you're not built for that. You're not built to hide. I don't think that people are built to hide. I think it destroys them. It's a really tough thing to understand, is like, how much trouble would you want there not to be? It's a weird question, right? Because you want to have something to contend with. You want to have something that forces from you the best that you have. And so you have to have real problems. It's something like that. Would you dispense with all your you could just lay down on a bed and have pablum infused into your mouth, if all your problems were solved. And so maybe you want difficult problems that you can solve, something like that, because there's some, I don't know what it is about it. There's the overcoming and the growth that comes along with that. There's something about the nobility of the enterprise. You certainly see that when you go about having children, for example, which is the people who don't have kids are happier. And so psychologists who tend to get things wrong, even when they make intelligent discoveries like that one, immediately, some of them, jump to the conclusion that because happiness is the goal, that, well, there's something about children that, make you unhappy, and that's not good. It's like, well, wait a second. Maybe that's the wrong metric. It's like, of course you're less happy once you have children, because you have to worry about them. My neighbor down the street, who's a very smart woman, said to me once, you can only be as happy as your unhappiest child. That's really smart. If having children doesn't make you happy, the answer isn't don't have children. It's like, don't be so stupid about being happy. That's the answer. It's because there's a nobility in the pursuit, right? And of course, now you're responsible. You have a new baby, you think, what the hell is this? And what am I going to do with it? It's like, and then you're done for the rest of your life. You never sleep properly again, because you're going to be worried about this creature that you have to take care of. But like, what the hell good are you if you're not doing that, or something else equally difficult? Because you just haven't been called out yet, unless you take on a responsibility like that. The idea that, that happiness is the purpose of life. It's like, great for happiness, man. If it comes along, you should be thrilled that it's visiting you. But the notion that that's what you should pursue, that's the weakest possible notion. First of all, as soon as something terrible happens to you, you're done. It's like, life is to be happy. It's like, well, now you have cancer. So how's that? How's the happiness thing working out for you now? Away from them. It's like, life is to be happy. That's not right. The rule is aim high and get your bloody act together. That's the rule. And establish this contractual covenant with the ultimate ideal. And that will see you through the catastrophes. And that's a much more mature way of looking at life, as far as I'm concerned, because all you have to do is have your eyes half open, and you see that the fundamental reality of life is tragedy and suffering. That's inescapable. That doesn't mean that it makes life unbearable, or that it makes being something that shouldn't have existed. Right? That isn't what it means. But it means that you have to contend with it, and you have to get ready. And the willingness to adopt responsibility for yourself and for others is the precondition for that. And then maybe if you do that properly, then now and then you get some happiness. You can sit at the end of a day and you have half an hour where your conscience is clear and there's nothing that you need to be doing, and you can relax and think, that's all right. Things are okay. And thank God for that. And that's maybe where you get your happiness. Part of the reason that modern people have been able to escape from the catastrophe of tyranny and slavery is because we've agreed to make ourselves our own slaves. Right? So instead of owning a slave, you own yourself, in a sense. And so you trot yourself off to work and exploit yourself so that you can stay alive. And maybe it's not something that you want to do, but you've taken on the role of slave in some sense in relationship to your own survival instead of forcing someone else to do it. If everything falls apart around you, there's a couple of things you're going to want. You're going to want someone standing beside you. That's for sure. That you can trust. You're going to want your family around you. And you're going to want them to have your back. And you're going to want to know that you didn't do some goddamn stupid thing to bring all hell down on yourself. And if you're lacking any of those, when that crisis comes, there's a high probability it will flatten you and you won't be able to get up. It does seem to me, you can ask yourself this question. When things collapse around you, how much utility is knowledge of your own moral virtue? It's bad to be laid low, but to be laid low and to know that you were you were at fault for it. And worse, the things that you did that you knew you did that were wrong brought you there. Then I think you have nothing to stand on in that situation. And that's also the circumstances under which I think you're more likely, at least, to be abandoned by people around you. So, given that you know that the catastrophe is coming, right, that the tragedy of life will strike you, the question is, well, how do you fortify yourself against that? I've asked myself a lot of questions in the last 8 months, man. I can tell you that. And I'm still asking myself a lot of questions. And I've been conferring with a lot of people, because I had lots of people who were helping me negotiate whatever the hell this is that's happening. And, I could ask them how I was doing, and they would tell me a bunch of things I was doing wrong and some things I was doing right, and I could listen to them. And I was asking questions all the time about how the hell I should manage this properly. And, what I was trying to do, and what seemed to serve me properly, was to figure out how to do it correctly. That was the issue. It's like, I didn't really care what happened, and I guess I really don't care what happens, but I do care if I do it correctly, because I don't want to screw it up. I don't want to screw things up. And that seems to be a reasonable goal for people. I mean, wouldn't you like that as a goal, that you don't screw things up? Because you can't control your life isn't fully under your control by any stretch of the imagination, but it might be nice to not have your conscience eating at you saying, look, you had a big opportunity there and you mucked it up because you're weak and blind and you didn't listen. That's no good. The catastrophe is bad enough, as I said, without you being the bloody source of it. What could you do to improve yourself? Well, let's step one step backwards. The first question might be, why should you even bother improving yourself? And I think the answer to that is something like, so you don't suffer any more stupidly than you have to. Accept responsibility for the catastrophe of your life. And that way you transcend it. And there's an unbelievably hopeful message in there. And the message is, you're actually strong enough to do that. You just don't know it. And you won't find out till you do it. You can't find out till you do it. But if you did it, you'd find out that it was true. Bargain with the future. Wow, that's just, what an idea that is. It's so unlikely. It's a massive risk. It's the ultimate in risks, right? You have to be willing to lose your life in order to find it. What you're willing to forego today's pleasure for tomorrow's advantage. And that's what sacrifice is. And I would say, start where you can start. If something announces itself to you as in need of repair, that you could repair, then, hey, fix it. You fix 100 things like that, your life will be a lot different. If I wanted to spend 10 minutes making this room better, what would I have to do? And you have to ask yourself that, right? It's not a command. It's like a genuine question. And things will pop out in the room that there's a stack of papers over there that's kind of bugging you, and you know that maybe little order there would be a good thing. There's some rubbish behind your computer monitor that you haven't attended to for like 6 months, and the room would be slightly better if it was a little less dusty and the cables weren't all tangled up the same way. And if you allow yourself just to consider the expanse in which you exist at that moment, there'll be all sorts of things that'll pop out in it that you could just fix. So life is brutal. And what you have to set against that is possibility. So I would say if you're 16 and your life isn't so happy, it's like look around and see if there are opportunities that people are granting you, even imperfect opportunities, because they're going to be imperfect, that you could exploit in the proper way and learn and grow. But the fundamental lesson, the more fundamental lesson that's underneath that is don't let what you are stop you from being what you could be. So imagine that there's you and there's the potential inside you, whatever that is, you know. And potential is an interesting idea because it represents something that isn't yet real, yet we act like it's real. And that potential is partly what you could be if you interacted with the world in a manner that would gain you the most information. If you take yourself and you put yourself in a new environment, new genes turn on in your nervous system. They encode for new proteins. And so you're full of biological potential that won't be realized unless you move yourself around in the world into different challenging circumstances, and that'll turn on different circuits. Now, I often tell people too, fix the things you repeat every day, because people tend to think of those as trivial. You get up, you brush your teeth, you have your breakfast, you have your routines that you go through every day. Well, those probably constitute 50% of your life. And people think, well, they're mundane, I don't need to pay attention to them. It's like, no, that's exactly wrong. The things you do every day, those are the most important things you do. Hands down. All you have to do is do the arithmetic. You figure it out right away. So 100 adjustments to your broader domain of being, and there's a lot less rubbish around and a lot fewer traps for you to step into. Once you've got your mind and your emotions together, and once you're acting that out, then you can extend what you're willing to consider yourself and start fixing up the things that are part of your broader extent. While you're experiencing things announce themselves as in need of repair, doesn't mean that it's you right then and there that should repair them. You have to have some humility. You don't walk up to a helicopter that isn't working and just start tinkering away with it. You have to stay within your domain of competence. But most of the time, if people look at their lives, it's a very interesting thing to do. I like the idea of the room because you can do that at the drop of a hat. You go back to where you live and sit down and think, okay, I'm going to make this place better for half an hour. What should I do? And you have to ask, and things will just pop up like mad. And it's partly because your mind is a very strange thing. As soon as you give it a name, a genuine aim, it'll reconfigure the world in keeping with that aim. That's actually how you see to begin with. And so if you set it a task, especially, you have to be genuine about it, which is why you have to bring your thoughts and emotions together, and then you have to get them in your body so you're acting consistently. You have to be genuine about the aim. But once you aim, the world will reconfigure itself around that aim, which is very strange. And it's technically true. And so I think that you can, in fact, decide to take on the load that's optimally meaningful if you want, and then you get to have your cake and eat it too. You're on the pathway to continual incremental improvement. You only have to burn off a feather at a time instead of having the whole bloody thing burst into flames. It's a constant source of renewal. And there's an idea that to be renewed, you have to drink the water of life. That's an old mythological idea. Chaos is water. Water is chaos. Water is what washes away too much order. And to stay continually refreshed by the water of life is to take on exactly the right amount of chaos to make sure that your garden is properly nourished. And I think meaning is actually the marker of that. You don't choose your interests, they choose you. And that's really worth thinking about too, man, because, it's really hard to get interested in something you're not interested in, even if you know there's a good reason for it. You're studying for an exam, you find the material boring, anything will be more interesting than the studying. Even though you know that that's what you need to do, you can't voluntarily grab yourself by the scruff of the neck, let's say, and shake yourself and say, sit down and concentrate. Your mind will just go everywhere. But then if you're interested in something, and even if it's something you shouldn't be interested in, because that happens all the time, then it's like you're a laser focused, man. You can pay attention forever. You can work until you're exhausted. You won't even notice it, and you remember everything. It's like, okay, if you can't control your interest, what does? Your interest was being manipulated behind the scenes by unseen forces that were associated with your characterological development across time. That was the manifestation of the self. So the self is the potential you, let's say. And the way it operates in the present is by gripping your interest and directing it somewhere. And that's part of the instinct of self-realization. It's a mind-boggling idea, man. Really, it's the potential that you are has to manifest itself somehow in the here and now. It has to. And what better way than by directing your attention? You know, it's like, it seems like this might be useful for you. Or maybe you get attracted to this person. Maybe you admire this person. That happens with kids a lot. They'll admire someone and then copy them. And you can see that that's obviously part of their developmental progression, right? It's a form of hero worship, but kids are very imitative and they hero worship at the drop of a hat. And so they're entranced by the next stage of development. And if they see someone who embodies that, especially if it's in the zone of proximal development, it's something they could achieve, stretching a bit. They find someone who embodies that next stage of development, and then they start to imitate them and act like them. Well, adults are no different. We're no different. We do it at a perhaps more abstracted, sophisticated level.
If you want to know something about yourself, sit on your bed one night and say to yourself, you got to mean this. Like, you got to be desperate. This is no game, this. It's like, my life is not everything I want it to be, and perhaps it's not everything that I need it to be. And by need, I mean, my life is so unbearable that the suffering that's attendant upon that is make me nihilistic, cynical, bitter, resentful, homicidal, genocidal, unable to have a good relationship, prone to punish people for their virtues because of my jealousy, driving the proclivity to see evil everywhere except within my own heart. Like, these are problems, man. And you ask yourself, you sit on the bed and say, okay, man, I'm ready to learn something. Like, what's one thing I'm doing wrong that I know I'm doing wrong that I could fix, that I would fix? It's like, you meditate on that, you'll get an answer. And it won't be one you want, but it'll be the necessary one. You know, and it's often something that will point you to small things. So Carl Jung said, people in the modern world don't see God because they don't look low enough. And so imagine you're in your messy bedroom, you know, and you're sitting on the edge of the bed trying to have an honest dialogue with yourself. And the little voice says, you know, it's pretty disgusting in here. And you think, well, I'm way above such trivial niceties as organizing my room. It's like, well, that's pride. That's arrogance. If you're above organizing what's actually yours, how in the world are you ever going to organize anything else? And so you get on your knees and you think, well, it's time to, you know, take a brush to the toilet. And maybe that's where you start. And so, and that works. Like, that works. You start making those micro improvements, like real micro improvements, real on the ground, actual micro improvements to things you know that are wrong. You'll improve unbelievably rapidly.
We deserve some respect. You deserve some respect. You are important to other people as much as to yourself. You have some vital role to play in the unfolding destiny of the world. You are, therefore, morally obliged to take care of yourself. You should take care of, help, and be good to yourself the same way you would take care of, help, and be good to someone you loved and valued. You may therefore have to conduct yourself habitually in a manner that allows you some respect for your own being, and fair enough. But every person is deeply flawed. Everyone falls short of the glory of God. If that stark fact meant, however, that we had no responsibility to care for ourselves as much as others, everyone would be brutally punished all the time. That would not be good. That would make the shortcomings of the world, which can make everyone who thinks honestly question the very propriety of the world, worse in every way. That simply cannot be the proper path forward. To treat yourself as if you were someone you are responsible for helping is instead to consider what would be truly good for you. This is not what you want. It is also not what would make you happy. Every time you give a child something sweet, you make that child happy. That does not mean that you should do nothing for children except feed them candy. Happy is by no means synonymous with good. You must get children to brush their teeth. They must put on their snowsuits when they go outside in the cold, even though they might object strenuously. You must help a child become a virtuous, responsible, awake being, capable of full reciprocity, able to take care of himself and others, and to thrive while doing so. Why would you think it acceptable to do anything less for yourself? You need to consider the future and think, what might my life look like if I were caring for myself properly? What career would challenge me and render me productive and helpful so that I could shoulder my share of the load and enjoy the consequences? What should I be doing when I have some freedom to improve my health, expand my knowledge, and strengthen my body? You need to know where you are so you can start to chart your course. You need to know who you are so that you understand your armament and bolster yourself in respect to your limitations. You need to know where you are going so that you can limit the extent of chaos in your life, restructure order, and bring the divine force of hope to bear on the world. You must determine where you are going so that you can bargain for yourself, so that you don't end up resentful, vengeful, and cruel. You have to articulate your own principles so that you can defend yourself against others taking inappropriate advantage of you, and so that you are secure and safe while you work and play. You must discipline yourself carefully. You must keep the promises you make to yourself and reward yourself so that you can trust and motivate yourself. You need to determine how to act toward yourself so that you are most likely to become and to stay a good person. It would be good to make the world a better place. Heaven, after all, will not arrive of its own accord. We will have to work to bring it about and strengthen ourselves so that we can withstand the deadly angels and flaming sword of judgment that God used to bar its entrance. Don't underestimate the power of vision and direction. These are irresistible forces, able to transform what might appear to be unconquerable obstacles into traversable pathways and expanding opportunities. Strengthen the individual. Start with yourself. Take care with yourself. Define who you are. Refine your personality. Choose your destination and articulate your being. As the great 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche so brilliantly noted, he whose life has a why can bear almost anyhow. You could help direct the world on its careening trajectory, a bit more toward heaven and a bit more away from hell. Once having understood hell, researched it, so to speak, particularly your own individual hell, you could decide against going there or creating that. You could aim elsewhere. You could, in fact, devote your life to this. That would give you a meaning with a capital M. That would justify your miserable existence. That would atone for your sinful nature and replace your shame and self-consciousness with the natural pride and forthright confidence of someone
who has learned once again to walk with God in the garden. You could begin by treating yourself as if you were someone you were responsible for helping.
You're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe, you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be. And that associates the goal, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement. The micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their, causal association with the goal. And that tangles in your incentive reward system. We talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day. You're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and already did that. You need a family, you need friends. You don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. That's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you.
It was easier for people to be good at something when more of us lived in small rural communities. Someone could be homecoming queen. Someone else could be spelling bee champ, math whiz, or basketball star. There were only 1 or 2 mechanics and a couple of teachers. In each of their domains, these local heroes had the opportunity to enjoy the serotonin-fueled confidence of the victor. It may be for that reason that people who were born in small towns are statistically overrepresented among the eminent. If you're 1 in a million now, but originated in modern New York, there's 20 of you, and most of us now live in cities. What's more, we have become digitally connected to the entire 7 billion. Our hierarchies of accomplishment are now dizzyingly vertical. No matter how good you are at something or how you rank your accomplishments, there is someone out there who makes you look incompetent. You're a decent guitar player, but you're not Jimmy Page or Jack White. You're almost certainly not even going to rock your local pub. You're a good cook, but there are many great chefs. Your mother's recipe for fish heads and rice, no matter how celebrated in her village of origin, doesn't cut it in these days of grapefruit foam and Scotch tobacco ice cream. Some mafia don has a tackier yacht. Some obsessive CEO has a more complicated self-winding watch kept in his more valuable mechanical hardwood and steel automatic self-winding watch case. Even the most stunning Hollywood actress eventually transforms into the evil queen on eternal paranoid watch for the new Snow White. And your career is boring and pointless. Your housekeeping skills are second rate. Your taste is appalling. You're fatter than your friends, and everyone dreads your parties. Who cares if you are Prime Minister of Canada when someone else is the President of the United States? Inside us dwells a critical, internal voice and spirit that knows all this. It's predisposed to make its noisy case. It condemns our mediocre efforts. It can be very difficult to quell. Worse, critics of its sort are necessary. There is no shortage of tasteless artists, tuneless musicians, poisonous cooks, bureaucratically, personality disordered middle managers, hack novelists, and tedious ideology-ridden professors. Things and people differ importantly in their qualities. Awful music torments listeners everywhere. Poorly designed buildings crumble in earthquakes. Substandard automobiles kill their drivers when they crash. Failure is the price we pay for standards, and because mediocrity has consequences both real and harsh, standards are necessary. We are not equal in ability or outcome, and never will be. A very small number of people produce very much of everything. The winners don't take all, but they take most, and the bottom is not a good place to be. People are unhappy at the bottom. They get sick there and remain unknown and unloved. They waste their lives there. They die there. In consequence, the self-denigrating voice in the minds of people weaves a devastating tale. Life is a zero-sum game. Worthlessness is the default condition. What but willful blindness could possibly shelter people from such withering criticism? It is for such reasons that a whole generation of social psychologists recommended positive illusion as the only reliable route to mental health. Their credo, let a lie be your umbrella. A more dismal, wretched, pessimistic philosophy can hardly be imagined. Things are so terrible that only delusion can save you. Here is an alternative approach, and one that requires no illusions. If the cards are always stacked against you, perhaps the game you are playing is somehow rigged, perhaps by you, unbeknownst to yourself. If the internal voice makes you doubt the value of your endeavors or your life or life itself, perhaps you should stop listening. If the critical voice within says the same denigrating things about everyone, no matter how successful, how reliable can it be? Maybe its comments are chatter, not wisdom. There will always be people better than you. That's a cliche of nihilism, like the phrase, in a million years, who's going to know the difference? The proper response to that statement is not, well, then everything is meaningless. It's any idiot can choose a frame of time within which nothing matters. Talking yourself into irrelevance is not a profound critique of being. It's a cheap trick of the rational mind.
Pick up your damn suffering and bear it. And try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. You know, I read a lot about the terrible things that people have done to each other. You just cannot even imagine it. It's so awful. So you don't want to be someone like that. Now, do you have a reason to be? Yes. You have lots of reasons to be. God, there's reasons to be resentful about your existence. Everyone you know is going to die. You know, you too. And there's going to be a fair bit of pain along the way. And lots of it's going to be unfair. It's like, yeah, no wonder you're resentful. It's like act it out and see what happens. You make everything you're complaining about infinitely worse. There's this idea that hell is a bottomless pit, and that's because no matter how bad it is, some stupid son of a bitch like you could figure out a way to make it a lot worse. So you think, well, what do you do about that? Well, you accept it. That's what life is like. It's suffering. That's what the religious people have always said. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together for Christ's sake so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner and you can help plan the funeral and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus, obviously. Put yourself together. And then maybe if you put yourself together, you know how to do that. You know what's wrong with you, if you'll admit it. You know there's a few things you could polish up a little bit, that you might even be able to manage in your insufficient present condition. And so you might shine yourself up a little bit, and then how do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. So you're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing and then you don't have any responsibility because who the hell cares? And you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be. And you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? And you'll find very rapidly that it isn't the majority of your soul that's pursuing the whole meaning thing, because, well, look what you have to do that. You have to take on the fact that life is suffering. You have to put yourself together in the face of that.
In my own periods of darkness, in the underworld of the soul, I find myself frequently overcome and amazed by the ability of people to befriend each other, to love their intimate partners and parents and children, and to do what they must do to keep the machinery of the world running. I knew a man injured and disabled by a car accident who was employed by a local utility. For years after the crash, he worked side by side with another man who for his part suffered with a degenerative neurological disease. They cooperated while repairing the lines, each making up for the other's inadequacy. This sort of everyday heroism is the rule, I believe, rather than the exception. Most individuals are dealing with one or more serious health problems while going productively and uncomplainingly about their business. If anyone is fortunate enough to be in a rare period of grace and health personally, then he or she typically has at least one close family member in crisis. Yet people prevail and continue to do difficult and effortful tasks to hold themselves and their families and society together. To me, this is miraculous, so much so that a dumbfounded gratitude is the only appropriate response. There are so many ways that things can fall apart or fail to work altogether. And it is always wounded people who are holding it together. They deserve some genuine and heartfelt admiration for that. It's an ongoing miracle of fortitude and perseverance. In my clinical practice, I encourage people to credit themselves and those around them for acting productively and with care, as well as for the genuine concern and thoughtfulness they manifest towards others. People are so tortured by the limitations and constraint of being that I am amazed they ever act properly or look beyond themselves at all. But enough do so that we have central heat and running water and infinite computational power and electricity and enough for everyone to eat and even the capacity to contemplate the fate of broader society and nature, terrible nature itself. All of that complex machinery that protects us from freezing and starving and dying from lack of water tends unceasingly towards malfunction through entropy. And it is only the constant attention of careful people that keeps it working so unbelievably well. Some people degenerate into the hell of resentment and the hatred of being, but most refuse to do so, despite their suffering and disappointments and losses and inadequacies and ugliness. And again, that is a miracle for those with the eyes to see it. Humanity, in toto, and those who compose it as identifiable people deserve some sympathy for the appalling burden under which the human individual genuinely staggers, some sympathy for subjugation to mortal vulnerability, tyranny of the state, and the depredations of nature. It is an existential situation that no mere animal encounters or endures, and one of severity such that it would take a God to fully bear it. It is this sympathy that should be the proper medicament for self-conscious self-contempt, which has its justification, but is only half the full and proper story. Hatred for self and mankind must be balanced with gratefulness for tradition and the state and astonishment at what normal, everyday people accomplish, to say nothing of the staggering achievements of the truly remarkable.
I had a rule with my clients because, you might say, well, I've gone halfway down this path and I found out it's wrong. So how do you distinguish that from just giving up? Well, that's a really hard question, right? It's a moral hazard because it's inappropriate to continue in a direction you now realize to be wrong. But it's also inappropriate to give up and use that rationalization as an excuse. And how do you distinguish?
Especially seeing as we're not transparent to ourselves.
Well, right, exactly. So that is genuinely a moral hazard. So one of the principles that I tried to abide by in my therapeutic discussions was you can change course as long as the next thing you do is equally or more difficult. Because that's a check against just giving up. So you want to discipline yourself so you can get yourself organized so that you can go in a particular direction, so that when you find the right direction, you can really go in that direction. And that does require an apprenticeship of sorts. And it might not matter in some sense exactly what the apprenticeship is, as long as it is rigorous, right? And so that's sort of a bridge between moral relativism and moral absolutism. There's lots of games you can play. It's not that obvious a priori which is the best game. So that's kind of a morally relative stance. There's multiple playable games. But then the absolute is, but you have to play one of them. You have to learn to play one of them. You have to become an expert at least one of them. And then that's not a relative proposition. And I believe that's true. That seems to me to be the case. So you want to commit to something. And then when you commit to something, you require yourself to bring all of your disparate components moving in a single direction, united in a single direction. So it's a unifying act. And then once having been unified, well, then you can bring that unity to bear on a variety of different tasks, but you have to bring it together first. So, and that makes sense developmentally. You see children start out as a disparate bundle of motivations and emotions sort of warring with one another. And then they can integrate that into single games that they can play with themselves. And then they integrate that with games they start to play with other people. And all of that is integration. It's not subjugation. It's not repression. Not if it's a good game, it's integration. You want to get integrated because then you have all the horses that are pulling your chariot pulling in the same direction. And you're much more likely to get to where you want to go then, and also much more likely to specify a good place to go. So that's that's something else conservatives have to teach young people, which is, well, get yourself disciplined. Well, why? Well, not so you're a slave, but so that you could be a master. To use a terminology that you're not supposed to use anymore. But, this is in relationship to yourself, not to others.
What you're doing, you don't know where you are, and you don't know where you're going. And if you're in a place where you don't know where you are or where you're going, you're in danger. Because that's unmapped territory, and God only knows what lurks in unmapped territory. If you're so confused and disoriented that you don't know where you are or where you're going, there are predators of the spirit who are much worse than snakes that are waiting for you. And the probability that you'll move from aimless, hopeless, joyless anxiety to nihilism, corrosive bitterness, and genocidal fantasy in the fundamental extreme is very high.
It's like, well, I just want to be happy. It's a slogan. It's the most common slogan of our time, I would say. And it's such a preposterous slogan. It's like, what do you mean just? You just want to be happy. That's all. That's all you want. That absolute impossibility. You want bliss unending, no matter what you do. And that's all you want. It's not exactly a small ask, let's say. Because it's the same thing as asking to dwell permanently in paradise. It's something like that. And then it also isn't true. That isn't what you want. If you do careful analysis of what people mean when they say they just want to be happy, what they mean is they don't want to suffer stupidly. We're much more concerned with not experiencing an excess of negative emotion than we are with experiencing a surfeit of positive pleasure. So first of all, we don't mean we just want to be happy. We mean, please don't make us too miserable. And fair enough, that's reasonable. But then even on the happiness front, even on the absence of misery front, that's not true. It's like it isn't obvious at all that we want happiness. It isn't even obvious that we want absence of misery. What's really obvious is that we want an adventure. Right? We want an adventure that's so compelling that it makes the misery of life not just justifiable, but worthwhile. You want to look back in your life, and you know this to be true. You want to be able to say to yourself, even considering a month or a week or a series of days, you want to be able to say, that was really difficult, but you know what? It was worth it. And I think that's what you want from your life. It's something like, you know what? That was difficult, but it was worth it. And that meant that the adventure was so great that it justified the difficulties. And so then the question is, and here's the question, where do you find the great adventure of your life? Well, how about in truth? Well, why? Because you don't know what's going to happen if you tell the truth. It's a mystery. It's going to lay itself out for you. And so that's an adventure because you literally do not know what's going to happen. You have to let go of knowing what's going to happen. And so then you have that adventure. And then what is also the case is that it's you that's having the adventure. Right? Because if what you're doing is living in truth, that's you. That truth is you. And so that means that whatever happens when you tell the truth is your adventure. And then you think, well, I'm using deception. It's like, well, maybe you are, but maybe deception is using you. And then maybe it's the spirit of deception that's having the adventure of your life. And then you might ask yourself, well, why are you so miserable and unhappy? And the answer would be, well, the spirit of deception is having the adventure of your life. You're not even there. Because if you're not living in truth, you're not there. Obviously, what's there is the spirit of deception. And you might think that's your deception, but I would be very careful about thinking that, because there have been centuries of meditation on the nature of the spirit of deception. And the answer isn't that the spirit of deception is you. The answer is that the spirit of deception is something that possesses you, convinces you that it's you. And that's not something you want to fall into the clutches of.
The world is founded on a sacrifice. Right? And that's what the crucifix represents. And European towns were built around a church, and the church was built around an altar, and the altar was built around the idea of sacrifice. So the proper sacrifice is at the center of the community. That's what that idea means. Now, you might ask, well, what's the proper sacrifice? And the answer is something like the voluntary willingness to bear your cross. And then you might say, well, what is your cross? And the answer to that is, well, that's the catastrophe of your life, right? That's the fact you'll be betrayed, the fact that you're going to die, the fact that you're going to be in pain, the fact that your loved ones will see you suffer, the fact that the mob will come after you, the fact that criminals might be preferred to you, etc. It's all the potential catastrophes of your life. And then the sacrifice is the idea that you have to let your, what would you say? You have to let your narrow ego go enough so that you pick all that up voluntarily, all of that. And then that transforms it. And I think that's literally true. I think that's what all the psychological evidence points to, is that if you adopt a stance of voluntary challenge, even in relationship to tragedy and malevolence, that's the pathway to transcendence. Do you have something to say that you're not saying? If you do, then it's your fault. This is your fault. It's your problem. And you might say, well, I'm too afraid to talk. It's like, fair enough. How afraid are you not to talk? You know, people say to me frequently, they compliment me on my bravery. And I think, you don't understand. I'm not brave. I don't like conflict. I'm way more afraid of losing control of my tongue than I am of the consequences of saying what I have to say. Because I know what happens when we allow other people to control our tongues. It's not good. It's not good. It's hell itself. And so, of course, it's troublesome to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune when you say what you have to say. It's like, that's fine. Try not saying what you have to say. Well, that'll be okay in the moment. It's like, yeah, in the moment. But unfortunately, your whole life isn't in the moment. Practice in developing the capacity for skilled movement forward in a manner that simultaneously encourages the others that you're cooperating with to do precisely the same thing. And that's not some arbitrary ethos. It's not arbitrary, because if that doesn't happen, then nothing flourishes. And if it does happen, then everything flourishes. It's also not relativistic in some sense, because you have to do that no matter what you're doing. No matter what it is that you're doing, if you do that well, you're doing whatever it is you're doing well. In fact, that's really, in some sense, how you would define well. If you give up enough psychologically, you'll cut your losses in actuality. And of course, that's sort of what thought's for, is right? So that you can get yourself straight. You can give it up in abstraction, so you don't act out the pathology, and then nothing dies in actuality. But that still means you have something to give up. You want to initiate a process of active engagement with the dragon that burned you, fundamentally. The psychophysiological pattern of active engagement is the opposite to the psychophysiological pattern of involuntary stress. And so if you can practice embodying that voluntary confrontation, then that stance can come to dominate. And that's the stance you want to dominate, because that moves you forward voluntarily into the world. And so, and that, in all probability, that will work. I want to be free to do what I want. Okay, well, hang on a sec. Which I are you talking about there? Are you talking about the mature I that sees next week and next month and next year and 10 years out, and that takes the community into account? Or are you talking about the impulsive, hedonistic, self-serving, narrow I that just wants exactly what it wants right now? And what makes you think that when you make a case for that hedonism, that you're not just falling under the sway of an impulsive, short-sighted demon, so to speak? If you look at music, for example, music operates by very sophisticated rules. And so it's ordered and constrained. But out of that system of rules comes an almost infinite array of possibility. And so, we have this sense, I think it derives from Rousseau, that any constraint of order is a limit on freedom, when what we should be hypothesizing is that with the optimal set of principles, you get the maximally desirable freedom. And it's not freedom from everything, and it's not freedom to do anything. It's certainly not a narrow hedonistic freedom, because that backfires on you like the next day. And you guys should listen to this, because I know what I'm talking about. If you happen to be creative, if you're a songwriter or another kind of musician or an artist or any of the other number of things that you might be, find a way to make money and then practice your craft on the side, because you will starve to death otherwise. Now, for some of you, that won't be true, but it's a tiny minority. Your best bet is to find a job that will keep body and soul together and parse off some time that you can pursue your creative thing, because then, well, as a long-term strategy, a medium to long-term strategy, it's a better one. You hear very frequently people say things like, everyone's creative. It's like, that's wrong. Okay? It's wrong. It's just as wrong as saying that everyone's extroverted. First of all, you have to be pretty damn smart to be creative, because otherwise you're just going to get to where other people have already got, and that's not creative by definition. So being fast and being out there at the front of things really makes a difference. And then you also have to have these divergent thinking capabilities, and that's part of your trait structure. And creative people are really different than non-creative people. Partly because, for example, they're highly motivated to do creative things and to experience novelty and to chase down aesthetic experiences and to attend movies and to read fiction and to go to museums and to enjoy poetry and to enjoy music that's not conventional music, for example. These aren't trivial differences. And so it's a real misstatement to make the proposition that everyone's creative. It's just simply not the case. It's a matter of wishful thinking. It's like saying that everyone's intelligent. Like, well, if everyone's intelligent, then the term loses all of its meaning. Because any term that you can apply to every member of a category has absolutely no meaning. The other thing you want to be thinking about here is that don't be thinking that creativity is such a good thing. It's a high-risk, high-return strategy. There's creative people in this room, man. You guys are going to have a hell of a time monetizing your creativity. It's virtually impossible. It's really, really difficult because, first of all, let's say you make an original product. You think the world will beat a pathway to your door if you build a better mousetrap. It's like, that's complete rubbish. It isn't true in the least. If you make a good creative product, you've probably solved about 5% of your problem. Because then you have marketing, which is insanely difficult, and then you have sales, and then you have customer support, and then you have to build an organization, and you have to, if it's really novel, you have to tell people what the hell the thing is. We built this future authoring program, right? It's available for people online. So how do you market that? No one knows what that is, and that's a real problem. If you write a book, well, then you have the problem that another million people have also written a book. But if you produce something that's completely new and doesn't have a category, people can't search for it online. How are they going to find it? And then you have pricing problems, and it's really unbelievably difficult to produce something creative and then monetize it. And even worse, if you're the creative person, let's say you have a spectacular invention. You've got no money, right? You've got no customers. Those are big problems. And so maybe you go and you find a venture capitalist. We start with family and friends because that's how it works. You raise money for your product. You raise money from your family and friends. That's assuming you have family and friends that have some money and that they're going to give it to you. And most people aren't in that situation. So it's a terrible barrier right off the bat. And then, of course, you're putting your family and friends at substantial financial risk because the probability that your stupid idea is going to make money is virtually zero, even if it's a really brilliant idea. And so then let's say, well, you get past family and friends and you get venture capitalists involved because that's often the next step, or an angel investor. There's steps in building a business. Family and friends, angel investor, that's some rich guy that you've happened to meet, some way, who's into this sort of thing and is willing to provide you with some money to get your product off the ground. Well, how much of your product is that person going to take? Well, most of it. And no wonder, because, you don't have any money. How are you going to bargain for control over your product? He'll just say, well, do you want the money or not? And if your answer is no, then he'll go and do something else with his money. It's not like there's no shortage of things that you can do with your money. There's a million things you can do with it. So you're not in a great bargaining position. And then if you get venture capitalists involved, they'll take another big chunk. And maybe if they're not very straight with you, they'll just throw you out. Because maybe by that point in the company's development, you're nothing but a pain in the neck. Because what do you know about marketing and sales and customer service and building an organization and running a business? Like, you don't have a clue. So why do they need you? So even if you're successful at generating a new idea and you put it into a business, the probability that you, as the originator of the idea, are going to make some money from it is very, very low. So don't be thinking that creativity is is something you would want to curse yourself with. Now, it's not all bad because it opens up avenues of experience for creative people that aren't available to people who aren't creative. But it definitely is a high-risk, high-return strategy. So the overwhelming probability is that you will fail. But a small proportion of creative people succeed spectacularly. And so it's like a lottery in some sense. You're probably going to lose. But if you don't lose, you could win big. And that keeps a lot of creative people going. But also, they don't really have much choice in it. Because if you're a creative person, you're like a fruit tree that's bearing fruit. So you don't really you can suppress it, but it's very bad for you. The creative people I've worked with is if they're not creative, they're miserable. So they have to do it. But And you know, there's real joy and pleasure in it and psychological utility, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's it's certainly not a conservative strategy for moving forward through life. What does it mean to think creatively? It's something like this. Imagine that I tossed you out an idea, and there's some probability that when I tossed you that idea, that will trigger off other ideas in your imagination. So you could think about it as a threshold issue. If you're not very creative, I'll throw you an idea, and hardly any other ideas will be triggered, and the ones that will be triggered are going to be very closely associated with that initial idea. So let's say I tossed each of you an idea, and I asked you to tell me the first thing that comes to mind. Okay, so what we would see first is that the first thing that comes to mind, in all likelihood, would be shared by many of you. Okay, so then you could think about that as a common response, right? And so that's a less creative response. And then there'll be some things that come to mind for you that are so idiosyncratic that you're the only person that thinks it and no one can understand it. Well, that's also not exactly creative, because the thing for something to be creative, it has to be novel and useful at the same time. That's sort of a rough definition. Something creative is novel and useful. So you can think of, you get thrown an idea, and there's some probability that will co-activate other ideas. And if it co-activates many other ideas, that's like fluency. And if it co-activates ideas that are quite distant from the original idea, something like that, and you could track distance by comparing it to probability that other people have generated it, then that's also another indication of creativity. So they have to be many unlikely responses that are useful. That's what creativity is, roughly speaking. And then you can fractionate it into different dimensions. So that's creative thinking. But then creative achievement would be the ability to take those original ideas and then actually to implement them in the world. And that's obviously much more different than merely being creative. Imagine what happens when you play Monopoly. What happens? Everybody has the same amount of money to begin with, right? So then you start playing. It's basically a random game. Well, some people start to win a bit and some people start to lose a bit. And then if you win, the probability that you'll keep winning starts to increase. And if you lose, your vulnerability increases as you lose. And then maybe you've got, say, 6 people playing Monopoly. Soon one person has 0. What happens when they have 0? They're out of the game. So 0 is a weird number, because when you hit 0, you're out of the game. So then if you keep playing, people start to stack up at 0, right? What happens at the end of the game? One person has all the property and all the money, and everyone else has none. Right, that's what happens if you play an iterated trading game to its final conclusion. It's not a consequence necessarily of structural inequality. It's built into the system at a deeper level than that. So, people talk about all the time about how unfair it is that the 1% of the population has the vast amount of the money, and 1% of the 1% has most of that money, and 1% of the 1% of the 1% has most of that money. It's an inevitable conclusion of iterated trading games, and we don't know how to fight it. We don't know how to take from the people who have and move it to the bottom without it instantly moving back up to the top. Different people maybe, but still back up to the top. Because even the 1% churns a lot. Like, I think you have a 10% chance, if I remember correctly, you have a 10% chance of being in the top 1% for at least 1 year of your life, and a 40% chance of being in the top 10% for at least 1 year in your life. That's in Canada and the US. It's less so in Europe. So there's a fair bit of churning at the top end. It's not the same people all the time who have the money, but it is a tiny fraction of the people all the time who have all the money. You learn through voluntary contact with that frightens or disgusts you. Carl Jung said his primary dictum was insterquilinus invenitur, which I'm sure I'm massacring because it's Latin, but it meant, in filth it will be found. You always learn when you're wrong, which is very annoying. Now, what do you learn when you're correct? You're walking in the world, you're operating in the world, you have a sense of what you want to have happen. You're always looking at the world through this sense of what you want to have happen. You're acting so that what you want to have happen will happen. And when it happens, well, then you're happy because, well, first of all, you get what you want, and that's good, maybe, depending on what you want. But it's also good because if you get what you want when you act, then it turns out that your model of how to act is valid, right? The outcome, that you get what you want indicates no error on the part of your model. But it's very frequently the case that when you act to get what you want, you don't get what you want. And then that's unpleasant because you don't get what you want. But it's even more unpleasant because it brings with it the hint of a suggestion that the manner in which you're construing the world is incorrect at some indeterminate level. So, for example, if you tell a joke at a party, you presume that people will attend, and then when they hear the joke, they will laugh. And then if you tell the joke and it goes flat, or even worse, disgusts and offends people, then you're going to be taken aback. And that's partly because you didn't get what you want, and that's not so good. But it's more because there's something wrong with the way you conceptualize the situation. And then you're faced with a problem, and the problem is the emergence of a domain of the unknown. It's like, well, what kind of mistake did you make? Maybe you're not as funny as you think you are. That could be a big problem. Maybe you're not around people who are the way you think they are. Maybe they don't like you as much as you thought they liked you. I mean, the potential for various paranoid thoughts of increasing severity to come welling up at you in a situation where you make even a trivial social mistake is quite broad. And when you make an error of that sort, you have to face it and sort through all the possibilities so that you can find out what it was that you did wrong and how to retool it so that in the future you don't make the same mistake. You have nothing to rely on in your life that's more crucial to your success as you move through life than your character and your personality. That's what you bring to every situation. And the more sophisticated you are in relationship to yourself and others, the more you understand people, the deeper you understand the nature of your own being, the more likely it is that you're going to proceed through your life in a manner that will make you pleased to exist rather than displeased to exist. As you interact with other people, you inevitably tell them what you want and what you don't want. When they give you what you want and what you admire, you respond positively to them, you pay attention to them, you smile at them, you focus your thoughts on them, you interact with them, and you reward them for acting in a particular manner. And when they don't respond the way that you want, then you punish them with a look, or by turning away, or by rejecting their friendship, or when you're a child, by refusing to play with them. And so we're engaged in the co-creation of personalities, our own and others. And that also brings up the same question. What is it that we are all collectively trying to be and trying to create? Honest communication between two people can produce personality transformation. And you know, you might think, well, you kind of know that already because there's something very engaging about a deep, honest conversation where you're able to say things that you wouldn't normally say, where you're being listened to by someone who's actually listening to you and you're listening to them. And in the conversation, you're moving both of you further to a different point. That's different than a conversation where you're right and you're trying to convince me, or I'm right and I'm trying to convince you, which I would say is the typical conversation. The healing conversation is more, well, what's up with you? You know, how are you doing? How's your life going? What sort of problems are you facing? What do you think about those problems? Can you conceptualize what a solution might be? Is there a way we could figure out how to get there? You know, it's a problem-solving conversation, and it's predicated on the presupposition that the person that you're conversing with has the capacity to grow in a positive direction if they so choose. There's lots of different places that you can act in the world, and there's lots of different ways you can look at it and survive. That's why you can be a plumber and a lawyer and an engineer, and those all work, right? Even though they're very different modes of being. And you can have different personalities and survive as long as you're capable of finding the place where your particular filters and behavioral proclivities match the demand of the environment. And a huge part, I would say, of successful adaptation is precisely that. I believe that you need to know what the world is made of, and I suppose that's the proper domain of science, but then you need to know how to act. And that's a whole different thing. And you need to know how to act. That's the thing you need to know most of anything, because of course you're a living creature, and action in relationship to desired goals is everything to you. And you can think about that from a Darwinian perspective. You have to act at least so that you can survive, at least so that you can find a partner. That's life. And so part of the question is, well, how does the world look if you think about it as a place to act? And the answer isn't a place of value-free objects. That's not what the world looks like. And you can't act in a world of value-free objects because there's no way of choosing between them. If everything has zero value, why would you choose one thing over another? You live in a world where things present themselves to you as of different value. You make yourself out of the information that you gather in the world. So you're an exploring creature. You explore specifically when the maps that you're using in the world are no longer orienting yourself properly, when they're producing errors. You go out and gather information and assemble yourself from the information that you discovered. There's some relationship between your personality and the manner in which your brain functions. I've often found it useful when I'm trying to remember something to have a story to hang the facts on. Otherwise, you're faced with the necessity of doing nothing but memorization. And it isn't obvious to me that memorization actually constitutes knowledge. What constitutes knowledge is the generation of a cognitive structure that enables you to conduct yourself more appropriately in life. And so I suppose you might say that you could argue that a course in psychology, especially in personality, is a course in applied wisdom as well, assuming that wisdom is in part your capacity to understand yourselves so that you don't present too much of an intolerable mystery to yourself, and also to understand others so that you can predict their behavior, understand their motivations, negotiate with them, listen to them, and formulate joint games with them so that you can integrate yourself reasonably well with another person and with a family and in society. You have to figure out ways of simplifying the world, right? Because you just can't do everything. And so people are specialized. They have specialized niches that they occupy. You could think about them as social niches. A niche is a place where your particular skills would serve to maintain you. And so if you're extroverted, you're going to look for a social niche because you like to be around people. And if you're introverted, you're going to spend much more time on your own. And so if you're an introverted person, for example, you're going to want a job where you're not selling and where you're not surrounded by groups of people who are making social demands on you all the time, because it'll wear you out. Whereas if you're extroverted, that's just exactly what you want. And so the extrovert sees the world as a place of social opportunity. And the introvert sees the world as a place to retreat from and spend time alone. And it turns out that both of those modes of being are valid. The issue, at least to some degree, is whether or not you're fortunate enough to match your temperament with the demands of the environment.